Welcome back again to Archaeology After Dark. I am, of course, your host, Daniel Rhodes, and my guest this week is Dr. Kara Cooney. Kara, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Daniel.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am an Egyptologist. I also call myself a recovering Egyptologist in the first chapter of my new book. I'm a professor of Egyptian art, architecture, and language at UCLA. I work with undergraduates and graduate students, and I'm a writer. So I have a lot going on.
So for those of you who haven't figured out what our topic is today, we are in fact talking about Egypt, Egyptology, and just anything in general, really. So what exactly does an Egyptologist do?
Well, there's a lot of training involved, and when I started graduate school, I hadn't done a master's. I went right from UT Austin to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and I needed to learn the language. So the first thing you have to get down to is learning Middle Egyptian, which is where it all starts. And then after Middle Egyptian, you might do Old Egyptian, and then you might do Late Egyptian. And then if you can put some Demotic and Coptic on there, that would be great. You need to learn Hieratic script. You have to get an idea of how Egyptian religion works, what the names of all the divinities are, how their names are written, what they look like. You need to have an idea of where the monuments, the important monuments around the country are. Pyramids, temples, domestic spaces, all tombs, all kinds of things. And then you need to try to commit to memory and learn how to date as many different objects as you possibly can. I do a yearly cycle. Well, I have an art history cycle where we talk about monuments and all different things at UCLA, but I do 1 year where I teach them how to date. And it's essentially guess that pharaoh. And you put up a statue of a king or a relief or something, and you give the students no context. And you're like, okay, go. What do we think? What dynasty? Okay, we got a dynasty. That's great. What king? Oh, and sometimes we can say early reign or late reign. Depends on how much of a producer that king was. But to be able to situate yourself within 3,000 years of Egyptian history, religion, culture, and production is really tough. And not as many other scholars have to deal with 3,000 years of history. I mean, you could be an American history specialist and say, oh, I'm a Jeffersonian. You're like, okay, cool. So
we have 250 years of history compared to something that's like 3,000 years old. I brought this up in a conversation I had earlier with a student from Sheffield University in England, and they have thousands of years of history compared to the 250 going on 275 years we have here. And there is just so much of history that we skip over here in the Americas just because no one was here to record it.
Just because it wasn't written in a way that we can understand it, and we don't trust verbal communal passing of the word. And so we ignore our indigenous communities. It's only when the white people show up that we start to consider it something historical and worthy of writing about in that way. Of course, that's changing. But that's why
thankfully that's changing.
It is changing. And I call the Great American Awakening. That's what I call it. But being an Egyptologist is a tough thing, but 3,000 years is a gift. And it gives me and anybody else who studies such a long time period the opportunity to look at the United States and say, you guys, when you say slavery happened a long time ago, you have no clue what you're talking about. No social system of such importance and cruelty is going to just go away because we pass laws. You think that the society hasn't embedded those things into their culture, you would be very wrong. In the Egyptologist minds, a lot of the things that we look at in the United States are so young, so recent, so intertwined, and we don't see them separated by big swaths of time because they're not.
So when you teach students about Egyptology, what figures do you focus on, or periods of Egyptian history do you focus on? Because like you said, there is 3,000 years of history to go through.
Yeah, I'm a New Kingdom and Third Intermediate Period specialist. So if I'm gonna go to an Egyptological conference and hang out with all of the specialists, and we're talking shop, I'll introduce myself as a social historian who specializes on the New Kingdom, the Ramessid period in particular, and the 21st dynasty. So that's my jam, that's my game. And I specialize in non the word would be non-literary, that's the word I'm looking for, non-literary texts about socioeconomics, particularly the village of Deir el-Medina, where thousands of ostraca were preserved, with everything from divorce documents to lawsuits to workshop receipts and other receipts where, I'm trading this donkey for this coffin and here's the price. Those are the things that really get me excited. And the social history is really fun, because then I get to situate myself in opposition, not in a brutal opposition, but in opposition to that typical Egyptology of mystery and magic and the pyramids and all of these things. I'm there to add some real pragmatic humanity to the discourse, and that's where I find my place.
So, you brought up an interesting subject. When people think of Egyptology, they think pyramids, mummies, magic, things coming back to life when they shouldn't. How do you differentiate when you're telling this to people, the fact and the fiction?
I think that the fiction is it works on our minds as exactly as it was meant to work on our minds. And what I mean by that is, when somebody stands in front of the Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, 50 stories tall, a mountain of stone, and they feel as if human hands could not have created that structure, that is exactly what the ancient Egyptian kings wanted you to believe. And that structure still works on our simple human minds today. That structure was meant to create in our minds and hearts an emotional response to kingship, such that it is infallible, inviolable. We can't criticize it. It is perfected. And as for the mummies coming back to life, that's what every elite would want us to believe, because mummification was only allowed or afforded by the top, 2% of society. And imagine living in a society where you believe that kind of physical transformation of the dead is possible, such that they can have a material manifestation for eternity. But that's only given to the top 2% of society, to all the rich people, to the patrons, and everyone else has to look on from afar. If we believe that those mummies live forever, I can imagine that the ancient Egyptian peasants looking on from afar believed very much the same thing. And that's where my social history comes into play.
So you research a lot of the day-to-day interactions. How do you find more information? Like, how do you get new information?
Well, I don't necessarily get new information, because there's a ton of stuff out there that people haven't properly analyzed. And so I'm looking at things that have already been dug out of the ground or found in a tomb, or even translated if it's a text. And I'm looking at it in a way that hasn't been looked at before. For example, there are a number of coffins of the 21st dynasty, about 800 coffins of the 21st dynasty, many of them in Cairo, probably 300, 350 of them in Cairo, and then another 700 or so spread around museums around the world. And I started to look at those coffins for reuse, because the 21st dynasty is a time period of crisis, when there's an economic recession, when the new kingdom falls. There's something called the Bronze Age collapse, no small thing. And if you look at the coffins, you start to see very clear evidence. You have to look carefully, you have to look inside of them, you have to look all around. But when you start to look and examine them closely, you will see evidence of coffin reuse. Sometimes not just one reuse, sometimes I've proven with the coffin stratigraphy of wood, plaster, and paint, as many as 4 reuses. And when you start to see that the way the Egyptians actually negotiated with these things they had created, these genies they could not put back in the bottle, like the rich people get a coffin, the rich people get mummification. When times get hard economically, the rich people have to keep that going, even if they have to take their own ancestors out of their coffins and update that coffin, replaster it, repaint it for the newly dead. It's a kind of a trap, which I love researching, and I love crawling around a coffin with my flashlight going, show yourself, So I'm not looking at anything that people didn't know was there. I'm just looking at it in a different way. And the amazing thing about ancient Egypt is it preserved so much stuff that we're practically deluged in objects. And it's hard to then find a research plan or how to study all of these objects looking for something new that somebody hasn't thought to look for before.
So when you say they're reusing a coffin, that means they're taking out the person who was originally in it, repainting it, redecorating it, and then burying the new person in it.
Indeed, indeed. And there's one tomb that's really helpful to put into this context. It's a tomb called Deeb Tomb 1. It's in Deir el-Medina, and it dates to the 19th and 20th dynasties. And in that tomb, which was found semi-intact, there were found 22 bodies, only 9 of them in coffins. And what I think this is a 20th dynasty end result, because the 20th dynasty is when the Bronze Age collapse was starting and things started to get really, really bad. And this family of people who belonged to the family of Sennacherib and Khonsu and other patriarchs in this family, they started to recommodify these coffins, and they would take their ancestors and put them aside with respect, probably with love if they remembered them. But I guarantee you they brought in magicians and priests to make sure that the angry dead didn't come and rise up and get really upset. And there's a really awesome text called Khonsu Emhab and the Ghost, which is about a high priest of Amun of the 20th or 21st dynasty. And he's getting haunted by this dude from the Middle Kingdom. And he's like, this is really awful. Your story is awful. How can I set your soul at ease? How can I make you stop haunting me? And the ghost is like, I need a coffin. I need a nesting coffin set. I need it to be gilded. And the guy's like, okay, I got it. And he gives him all of this stuff. And then the ghost stops haunting him. So there is anxiety about what the Egyptians are doing and what it will do to their effective dead. But the rich need that materiality to show and differentiate themselves from the rest of society so much that they will engage in this no matter what the cost. And the other way I look at it is, some people are like, how dare you say the Egyptians would reuse? It's so immoral. I don't think it's immoral. If you believe that the only way to transform your dead is by using this materiality, and that the dead that are already in there have already been transformed, then the only moral thing to do is to repurpose that materiality for the dead who need it now. So there's all kinds of negotiation that we hadn't thought to look for, because there's so much stuff in Egypt. You just assume that they could make all of these things from scratch, and they couldn't. And that's been really, really fun.
Yeah. So it's not reusing, it's more like recycling.
Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm calling my book on this subject. I'm calling it Recycling for Death. And I use words like reuse. I use words like recommodification. There's all kinds of words. It's not always theft. Sometimes it is. It's an interesting thing when you see some rich dude's coffin set, and if you look at the inner pieces, like the mummy board and the inner coffin, and the gilded face and hands have all been taken away, but on the outermost piece, they're still there. That means the rich are also stealing from themselves, and they don't want anyone else to know it, because who's going to look inside the nesting coffin set, right? So there's all kinds of little circumstantial clues that give you an idea of what this time period was like. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I assume you have to physically go to Egypt every now and then.
Oh yeah, I do. Yeah.
Has COVID made doing what you do difficult? I assume so. That's why.
Oh yeah. No, I haven't been. I mean, we've all been. I'm in California, which has experienced, I think, more lockdowns than other places. We've also experienced more high COVID numbers than many other places. I'm in the city of Los Angeles, so it was pretty bleak here. I think it was like 1 in 3 people were infected with COVID at one point in December of 2020. That was pretty hard. But, I've not gone to Egypt for the last 2 years. I did have a research trip planned in September, and I had to cancel that. So, I'll try again. Maybe I can go in December. But, I have a grad student there right now, and he's traveled there twice, and but he did catch COVID. So, it's a hard time to be alive in the world. It's an interesting time.
Well, that was going to be, something I was leading into. How do you stay connected to your field of study if you can't physically go there to see it and touch it and be
Yeah,
immersed in it?
I have a tremendous amount of data that I've already collected. So I have more than enough writing to do with the data that I have. There's also amazing publications that make sure that all of these ostraca, these limestone sherds or pottery sherds with texts on them are published, and I can use those. The book that I just wrote, The Good Kings, was easily done using libraries only and didn't need anything that I needed to analyze in person. So when you're writing histories and you're coming up with a fresh perspective on history, having to go to the place or getting to go to the place is not necessarily required. So I was able to do all of the writing and editing of that book without setting foot in Egypt, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why that would be helpful that you could, stay in one place and not be restricted to, being in Egypt for, 6, 8 months at a time and then having to fly back and forth because jet lag, I imagine, is detrimental.
Yeah, especially coming from California. Jet lag going to Egypt is brutal. It'll take me a good 12 hours just to get to Frankfurt and then or wherever, and then I transfer to Egypt. It's not an easy trip. But no, and you can, I'm in my library and you can see the books all around me. There's more than enough to go on, more than enough to do. And if I'm working with ancient texts, then there's a lot for me to say without having to look at the originals. I go to Egypt probably once a year. There are some years before COVID, obviously, when I was in Egypt, I made 3 trips, and that can be pretty tough on the body. But especially the older I get, we make it work.
Now, field work in general is detrimental to one's health over time. I was on a survey for 3 months at a time, and when I got back, I just laid on the floor for 2 weeks because I didn't
Yeah.
want to go any.
No, it's true. And field work, a lot of my grad students are really into field work. They love it. They join expeditions. My field work is to museums because it's easier. I'm not a dirt archaeologist. I wouldn't know how to set up a square if you had a gun to my head. I don't know how to use a theodolite. I rely on others to help me do these things. So instead, I'm an object analyst. And so I'll go into a museum and take what other people have dug out of the ground and then do careful analysis on that work or on those things. But when you're dealing with museums and you've got limited opening hours, you know how important field work is, and you have to get every last bit of blood out of stone, right? And I'll go into a museum and they're like, oh, we can give you 4 hours today. I'm like, okay, 4 hours with one piece. What can I do? How can I? And you have to fully document it photographically. I have to do all my notes to see things in person that I won't be able to see as easily from the photograph. And I have tens of thousands of photographs of all of these different objects that I've been working with. And that's the data that I'm working with now for my book, Recycling for Death. So that field work also, Daniel, when you're on an excavation, you need a lot more people. You need somebody to do the sieving and the flotation and the this and the that, and the drawing. I don't need all of those things. I need photographers. I need my eyes. It'd be great if I have somebody there with a dyno light attached to their computer and they can do some more intense investigation. I need my infrared camera person, and then we're good to go. So I can go to Egypt with a team of 4 or 5 and come out ahead. So and a small team working with objects is generally the way to go as well.
Actually, that's the fewest number of people I've ever heard be on a field team. All the field teams I've been on have been, going on 20 plus people, and we all have to borderline like each other for 6 months at a time. And I'm like, oh no, I'm gonna kill some of these people and I'm gonna have to live.
It's true. I mean, and you know what field work is like, how intense it can get, and how important relaxation is on a dig, and how important alcohol becomes to some people. If you're all living together, how important sexuality becomes to some people, and you're like, please don't do that on my dig. Oh, you just did that on my dig. Things like that can get pretty intense with my work. museum work is different. So it's intense. We need our relaxation time, but we don't have to wake up at the crack of dawn. If we showed up at the crack of dawn, the museum people wouldn't be there for another 4 hours. So we situate ourselves in the normal cityscape, and it's a more anthropological, different kind of research. Super small team, which means that grad students often get competitive to get on my team. And I don't necessarily go every year. And when I do, I might just bring one or two, because that I can keep my seasons lean and mean. I don't have to apply for money and funding every year. You guys do. That's exhausting, and I don't want to be a part of that game. So if I can get a small grant together and bring 2 or 3 or 4 students, way easier for me, way less stress in and out of the year than what you guys have to deal with.
Oh yeah. So you bring up an interesting concept. Is it weird being like, do the Egyptians you work with feel weird, like inviting an American to do their cultural studies for them?
Yeah, I would say that Egypt, in terms of a colonial state, is going through the same post-colonial movements that Mexico went through, I don't know, let's say 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, right? You are demanded that every expedition have a native representative, that you co-write, that everything needs to be in the native language, Spanish in the case of Mexico, Arabic in the case of Egypt, as well as in the language of the people who are coming from the outside. Nationalism is very real in Egypt, and the real anger and awakening is also very real. So if you look at Egyptian social media these days, and you look at the Ministry of Antiquities, and you follow new discoveries, you will, and you say you get something that's translated in the Arabic, right? Which I often do. You're on Facebook or some social media, and you look at the translation. My Arabic is not good enough to be able to just read it. My Arabic is spoken really only, and very bad. And so you read something in translation, and it'll say, "With pure Egyptian hands, this was discovered." And that's a very important statement for Egyptians. They're sick of having a racist field of Egyptology that has excluded Egyptians systematically from a study of their own country for centuries. And so there is a very earnest pushback against that colonialism continuing. And so most of the discoveries and even the dissemination of foreign expeditions are made through the Ministry of Antiquities, as they like, at the time that they like, as they wish. Most people who work in Egypt, well, not all do, but they should have Egyptian partners. I did some work outside of Karnak with a colleague, Issam Naji, and he's the director, and I came in as an interested party. But you should always be working with Egyptians in Egypt, in my opinion. And those that don't will come up against problems. So yes, all of these things are an issue, just as you might imagine. All these things need to be an issue, and it's something that will be negotiated and renegotiated, I suspect, over the next century. Colonialism is so cruel and so messy, and turns part of the society internally against itself, which is why when colonialism extracts itself, it's never fully gone, and it turns part of a population against itself, and you have civil wars and all kinds of internal issues. So any sort of post-colonial reality is going to involve a great deal of messiness, and that's the situation that you have in Egypt right now.
And that's something we had to deal with here in the United States after the American Revolution ended. Is what were we going to do without British help, British influence, British support for whatever value it still had? And that's something. And that's something.
Interest to me. I don't know about that. That's really interesting.
That's something I think Egypt has had to deal with, because they've been, invaded by Britain, France, Napoleon's people were there for some time. I heard a story that one of his cannons might have blown the nose off the Sphinx. So there's that.
That story continues to spread. It's possible. I don't know if they would actually do target practice on the Sphinx. I don't imagine the officers would allow such a thing, but who knows? I mean, the other thing that it's done is that we value things that, like the Description de l'Égypte, commissioned by Napoleon when he was in Egypt, much more than we value Arabic texts that tell us a lot about ancient Egypt and from not as much time removed. So there are Arabic texts of 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th century that have a great deal to say about ancient Egypt and monuments and language and other things. And those are largely ignored by Egyptologists because Egyptology is so Western facing and so communicative to a white European audience. And it is a trope to say, oh, the Egyptians don't care about ancient Egypt. Well, if you look at Arabic sources, you can see that there's all kinds of discussions about what this language was, what it means, what these hieroglyphs are about, and we overlook those. So those are being worked with again now, and that's nice to see as well.
So speaking of languages, do they still use Egyptian as a language, or is it primarily Arabic now?
I have been told, though I have never been to these places, there are supposedly villages in Upper Egypt where Coptic is still spoken. I would suspect that if Coptic is still spoken in certain villages, it will be Sahidic Coptic, that will be an Upper Egyptian variety, and it's probably only spoken by the older people of society. Languages are being lost all over the globe. This is not an unusual phenomenon.
Yeah. Where
Coptic is preserved is in the Coptic Christian Church. It's not preserved as a living language there, but the liturgy is in Coptic, and all of the chanting and the rituals are in Coptic. It's an interesting thing, though. If you're a part of a Coptic church and you have a Bible, it will still be in Arabic. However, people don't hold a Coptic Bible in their hands. The liturgy is there in Coptic, but the Bible that they read is in the language that they grew up with, which is Arabic, which is not native to Egypt, brought in from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th and 8th centuries. So it's an imposed language and an imposed culture, and it is not Egypt's first colonialism to deal with. There was a Greek colonialism before that under the Ptolemies, for instance. But Arabic is a colonialism that really drove Egypt. It drove a wedge between Egypt and its own native language for the first time. Greek was starting to do that, but people in Egyptians maintained their Egyptian language side by side with Greek. When Arab colonialism came in, and Arabic language became so useful for getting a job, being a part of the bureaucracy or the army, getting ahead in the world, Egypt really fell by the wayside, and rather quickly, within just a couple hundred years. And Arabic is the language used in Egypt today. And now it gets interesting, though. If you go to Egypt and you ask somebody, what are you? We Americans love to ask this question, particularly white people, right? Because we have our DNA tests and our stories of our, in my case, half Italian, half Irish ancestry or whatever. So we're always, what are you? Black people can't answer this, of course, because that answer has been wrested from them through enslavement. But if you go to an Egyptian and you say, well, what do you consider yourself to be? There will be a lot of, are you an Arab Egyptian? Are you Arab? Are you African? Or what do you consider yourself in terms of skin color? How do you situate yourself in the world? And there it gets really complicated, because Egypt is arguably currently being colonized by places like Saudi Arabia, UAE, lots of money coming in from these places that encourages Egyptians to look more to West Asia, to the traditional parts of the Middle East, than to Africa. And to look at Africa with a more leery eye, because you've got a dam being filled in Ethiopia and Sudan, and two dams, that is making the Nile, slow to a crawl. It's becoming a dying river. And the Egyptians started this, of course, with the Aswan High Dam in their own country. And so this idea of what, we say Egypt is in Africa. I mean, obviously it's in Africa, but it's there on the crossroads of three worlds. And Egypt is a beneficiary of all of the colorism, the racism, the colonialism that the whole world is dealing with. So it's super complicated. If you ever tried to tell the Egyptians that they were Black. The word Black is very negatively perceived, and they would say, no, no, no. It's not necessarily that they're trying to be racist by saying they're not Black, but the word Black has been imposed in such a negative way that there is a disassociation from that word. There is not, however, necessarily a disassociation from their Africanness. And for instance, there was a mini series every Ramadan. The Egyptians have giant parties and they watch TV with their family and they stay up all night, and it's super awesome. And they do these mini series where the whole family gets to watch some sort of mini series, the way we used to do in the United States over certain holidays. And they did one about King Ahmose, the king of the 18th dynasty, who took Egypt back for Egyptians against the Hyksos. And, it's this amazing story of an Upper Egyptian king, a southern king. And the guy that they cast to be this Ahmose looks as white as you or I and had a beard. And there was such an outcry over the casting of this guy that was obviously not Upper Egyptian, didn't look like an Upper Egyptian. It looked like a white colonial imposition of Alexandrians or Cairenes on people of Luxor or Asyut or wherever. And it was such a tremendous outcry within Egypt that the president canceled the miniseries. So there's a lot of internal dialogue about what it means to be Egyptian, and how one is to understand that. And it's really interesting to see from afar. It's not my conversation, but certainly something I can watch and listen to.
Oh, yeah. So you have a few minutes to talk about your book?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So The Good Kings, right?
Yeah.
Is available. Tell us a little bit about it. There you go.
So the book is a mad and crazy scheme of mine that came about during the Great American Awakening. We Egyptologists deal with Egyptian history rather uncritically, positivistically, even in some cases celebratorily. And as our own United States and other parts of the world are flirting with authoritarianism in all different kinds of ways, I wanted to look at ancient Egypt from that perspective. And so I'm looking at ancient Egypt through the lens of what is absolute power? Why do the many give power to the few? Why in Egypt did they do it for 3,000 years, if not longer, if we look at Egypt today, maybe 5? What is absolute power, and how does it package itself? And how did the Egyptians excel at presenting themselves as good and moral? We think of authoritarianism and something might pop into your brain, like a picture of Gaddafi with his military kit and his Ray-Bans or something, right? Or you might think of Mohammed bin Salman and a particular way of ruling Saudi Arabia. And you don't think of democracies. You don't think of how authoritarianism always shields itself in the ideology that is most pervasive, accepted, and considered moral. And that's why authoritarianism, as it sneaks back into our world, or is already here and never left, is doing so in the guise of democracy. And so instead of your authoritarians of today showing themselves in a military kit, they would look like those 1960 authoritarians that we don't want to associate ourselves with. They wear a suit and tie. They look like the businessman. They look like the normal everyday guy. And they're elected into power. And then they might take emergency powers and cement what their authoritarianism is. Authoritarianism happens along a gradient, and it's that place that I started from. So I chose 5 kings to look at from this perspective. And those kings are Khufu, Senwosret III, Akhenaten, the inventor of monotheism, maybe we can discuss, Ramses II, and Taharqa. And for each of these, I'm looking at them through the lens of power and the presentation of power. So for Khufu, I start with the pyramids, right? The Great Pyramids of Giza, the things that when we think of Egypt, that's what we think of first. And I present it as something that Khufu had to do. The power of his dynasty was waning. His father, Snefru, started out the 4th dynasty by building not 1, but 3 pyramids, trying to get the straight-sided pyramid correct. And then Khufu follows up on that with a pyramid that is taller and bigger than any other before, and had a floating granite chamber called the Grand Gallery inside of it. A wonder that we still can't crack how it was built, right? And I set this up as short-term versus long-term solutions. So yes, building that thing granted that king, Khufu, and probably his immediate successors, extraordinary ideological power. He becomes a god in people's eyes. There's still gods in our eyes, or aliens, or whatever it is, right? But once
Just
that
the History Channel, they're aliens.
yeah, right, exactly. But then once that genie is out of the bottle, and to create that pyramid, he has to empower bureaucrats. He has to give them what they want. He has to pay them not just a living wage, but make them rich. He has to let so much control and power go that it enfeebles the kingship forever after. The kingship is never as strong as it was when that pyramid was built, or maybe just before that pyramid was built. So it's about the optics of power, and what we see as being an element of extraordinary, infallible power is generally the beginning of the end of it. And then I talk about, after Khufu's reign, no pyramid ever attained that size and complexity again, even though 3 were built on the Giza Plateau, and their dynasty fails after another 3 kings. And then it goes on to another set of kings in the 5th dynasty who were like, built a pyramid like that? Us? No, never. We're like good priest kings. We would never do something so grabby and diva-like. And they disassociate themselves from the 4th dynasty. Kind of like, when a politician comes along who's so strong, like Trump, you either associate or you disassociate, and people have to make that choice. There's no wishy-washy, like, oh, maybe I'm going to be a part of it or not. You associate or you disassociate. And it's the same with Egypt. So, I'm in a nutshell, I don't want Egypt to be fetishized and distanced and made mysterious and magical. I want to make it political, and I want to make it real. And I don't want us to have our modern exceptionalism. Oh, we would never be so stupid as to worship god kings. Oh, really? You think so? And so I'm messing with both sides. I'm messing with the Egyptian narrative in a way that Egyptologists ain't gonna like. And I'm messing with the modern narrative in a way that many Americans and modern people aren't going to like, because they think they're so far beyond these things. And so I'm just kind of poking a whole lot of bears with this book.
Well, that's something, we love to do as archaeologists, historians. We love to take a sharp stick and just jam it at somebody, be like, hey, we're changing the story a little bit. I hope that's okay. Yeah. And they're like, no, that is not okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to do it anyway. So,
yeah. And these are sacred stories. Oh, what's that? Weird. I don't know what just happened. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's fine. We have technical issues all the time.
Okay, good. I think somebody keeps trying to call me on Messenger, which is a problem. I have a lot of friends on Messenger, and then when they try to call me and I'm not expecting it and they're not really my friend, then I have to block them. So these are the things. But yes,
it's the choices we have to make.
Yeah, that's true. But anyway, poking bears with sticks. Yeah, these things are made sacred, and we have to take our sacred cows and make them less so. So yes. Yeah.
So I think that'll about wrap us up for the day. Say, anybody who sees this wants to learn more about Egyptology, what would you recommend they do aside from physically going to Egypt?
Just start reading. Read something that is inspiring to you. There's a lot of Egyptology books out there. Most of them are rather hard to read because you'll get like the complete Tutankhamun or the complete temples, and while there's huge amounts of data in there, they're more reference volumes and they are readable. And so you want to find some book that really draws you in, where you're able to get a better understanding of what this place and people were like. Look at images, look at art books, and try to understand. Most, because of colonialism, right or wrong, many American cities have museums with Egyptian objects, and you might be surprised to find that there are Egyptian objects in the place where you live or close by, and that you can go and visit those things. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And if you can get to Egypt, You know, that would be great. Do so. You don't have to go on an expensive tour. You can get a whole bunch of books together, do your research, and head over there on your own. And when you settle into your nice hotel, wherever it is, Cairo, Luxor, or whatever, then you set up the tours from there. There'll be lots of opportunities for you to self-cater. You don't have to spend. Some of these tours are like $8,000. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
So it's insane. So get your plane ticket, go stay at a reasonably priced hotel, and you'll be able to do this for a lot less money than you thought.
So those of you who are watching this and are still college students, we would prefer to you spend that money on going to class rather than a $8,000 trip to Egypt. You can do that once you graduate and have, the secure full-time paying job.
Yeah, don't do it now. Don't do it now. And if you want to connect with antiquity, there's so much antiquity here in North America that one can see and find. It is around us, and there are many living representatives of the native tribes and institutions that you can connect with as well.
Yeah. So that'll do it for today. Kara, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed this one. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. I had a lot of fun talking to you.
Well, that'll do it, everybody. See ya.
Take care.